Ever feel panicked about the future, filled with dread? Well, today I'm at Panic World Headquarters. This is Caesarea Philippi. Toward the end of his earthly ministry, Jesus brought Peter and the other disciples up here to the extreme northern reaches of the country. Now, in Peter's time, this was a Roman-style town with a spa and impressive temples. Shrines were carved into this enormous cliff face with a gaping cavern. A spring-fed waterfall roared through here. From prehistoric times, this was a place of pagan worship. By the time of Peter, this cave was venerated as one home of the pagan god Pan. Pan, the god of panic. In fact, we get our English word panic from his name. Roman soldiers prayed at this temple for their enemies to be filled with panic. But you gotta ask, why are Peter and Jesus and the other disciples way up here at a pagan god of panic's temple, about as far distant from Jerusalem and their temple way down in the south as it is physically possible? Well, it's to escape the pressure that exists for Jesus further down south. You see, it's now been 3 years since Jesus started his ministry, and that Jerusalem political machine is becoming more and more extreme in their opposition to Jesus, as they have with other threats to their power in the past. They have plans to eliminate this upstart Jesus. And so any trip back down there would ignite that powder keg. And Jesus knows it's not quite time for that yet. But that means that many of his early followers have become impatient, disillusioned. They expected him to march into Jerusalem and overthrow the Romans and their own corrupt rulers. And so when Jesus, instead of going to Jerusalem, comes up here and seems to delay, they lose confidence in him. And I imagine even Peter looks around at all the intimidating, big, beautiful, rock-carved temples here at Caesarea Philippi, and he remembers Jerusalem with its beautiful big temple. And for all his sacrifices, leaving Comfortville to follow Jesus, he's got nothing to show for it. No beautiful buildings, fewer and fewer followers. Nothing seems to be going right. And that's kind of where their heads are at when Jesus asks them, "So, who do you say I am?" And Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." The Messiah. The people were always waiting for another Messiah, or Christ being the Greek word for Messiah. Remember, Messiah means anointed one. It's the word used for prophets, priests, or kings anointed by God to serve him in some special way. But the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, prophesied that one day God would send the Messiah. Prophet, priest, and king all rolled into one. He would be the Son of God, the final Messiah. And Peter says, "I think you are that one." And I love Jesus' reply. He is astounded, really. Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven." Now, did you get that? It's actually kind of funny. What Jesus is saying is, wow, I know you did not come up with that on your own, Peter. And if you read Peter's story, you really get what Jesus means. Peter is not, whatever Enneagram number means, perceptive analyst of subtle cues who carefully weighs his words. And half of you just shouted out that number. No, Peter is whatever number means, doesn't pick up on cues, socially awkward, says whatever comes to his mind, not exactly perceptive all the time. So Jesus is like, wow, I know this was like supernatural. You did not come up with this one by yourself. That must have been revealed to you by my Father in heaven. And then look what he says in verse 18, and this is the verse I want to camp out on here. "And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. Do you see how he's talking about building on rock? Right here, in the very place where there was a temple built out of a giant rock. And Jesus even makes a pun on two different words for rock here. Peter's name from Petros means little stone, and then the word used in the phrase upon this rock, Petra, from the same root, means a giant rock. You see, Jesus is saying, from you, Peter, a little pebble, I will build a church, an assembly, a movement that will outlast and will be stronger than any of these stone temples. But notice, he says not Peter will build the church. He says, I will build the church. He builds it, not us. We're just the little stones. He's got a greater plan. Let me make this personal. I went through a time in my own life when I experienced panic. Literally was diagnosed with anxiety attacks. I was filled with a continual sense that something horrible was always around the corner. The other shoe was going to drop and it was going to be dreadful. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't focus, I had no appetite. And I ended up in the hospital and had to take a little break from my ministry as a pastor. I wondered if all my meager efforts for God were just meaningless. Well, I got to tell you, I am so thankful for a godly doctor who helped me get through that tough time. I'm also very thankful for good medication and for lifestyle changes that I made. But I got to be honest with you, my main source of stability was this verse. This verse means so much to me. The words of Christ in this very passage, these words became my anchor because they meant to me that Jesus, he's not dependent on me as pastor. Yes, I am a part of his movement, and that's a blessing. But Jesus is the one building it. And the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. That means my life is not wasted. My efforts are not in vain. I am just a little pebble, but I am part of his great plan. Now, Peter had to be feeling pretty good at this point. Wow, I got the answer right. Verse 21 says, from that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and on the third day be raised to life. Verse 22, Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. And again, this is like the gall of Peter, let me rebuke you, Jesus. Never, Lord, he said, this shall never happen to you. And Jesus turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. And I think Peter must have been like, wait, 2 minutes ago I was a building block and now I'm a stumbling block? 2 minutes ago I was brilliant and now I'm Satan? But Jesus was just saying, Peter, okay, you get that I am the Messiah. That's a step toward understanding me. But the way you are understanding the Messiah and his agenda is still from a human political perspective that would just go on to bring more sorrow and more violence and more evil to this country. And you know what? Every single time in Christian history that we have made Peter's mistake, that we've replaced Jesus's self-sacrificial call to service with a human political agenda based on power and force, it has really turned out to be satanic. It's brought violence and evil. But you see, Peter's prayers had been for the liberation of his country, not for Jesus to die. And Jesus is saying, But Peter, God's ways are so different from your ways. And it's true for us today too. Sometimes what seems to us to be a complete disaster, a catastrophe, turns out to be what God uses for the greatest good. And of course, the most profound example of this is the sacrifice of Jesus, as we will see. But go with me on something here. I love that both of these stories about Peter, he nails it and he spouts complete ignorant heresy, are right next to each other in the gospel accounts. It shows me these authors are definitely not whitewashing history. And to me, that's what makes these gospel stories clearly actual recollections about how real people behaved and not just some kind of religious propaganda, right? Because if you're going to make up some invented religion, and you, as Peter, were going to paint yourself as sort of the hand-picked number 2 guy, the successor to Jesus, and you're trying to create your mythology, your legend, to enhance your credibility, you definitely would not make yourself out to be as obtuse as Peter comes across in these stories at some times, right? You would paint yourself as so quick to understand what the master's trying to teach, and certainly once the light bulb goes on over your head, you would never turn back. You would outpace all the other disciples in your faithfulness and strength. But here, Peter says this brilliant thing and almost instantly blows it again. If this was mere fiction, Peter would be on this constant upward trajectory, and instead, he promptly puts his foot in his mouth again, and again, and again, and again. In other words, he's just so true to life. He's so much like you and me. You may feel dread, panic right now, anxiety, a feeling that life is purposeless, like you're just a little pebble, unimportant. Don't panic. The Prince of Peace is far greater than the power of panic. And you know what? He uses little pebbles like you and me and Peter to build his kingdom that will last forever.